Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighborhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
There's also, I think, this very widespread public narrative about, like, I gotta walk on eggshells. There's these things I can't say. If I step out of line, the big bad, lobby is gonna come after me and destroy my career. And so somebody who feels impervious to that is a very powerful symbol of that perceived silencing effect being broken. And I think people get a very, ecstatic, almost orgasmic pleasure out of finding that freedom.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, host of The Jewish Angle from the Canadian Jewish News. Two things are happening these days whose exact relationship is hard to tease out. One is that Israel is becoming less popular globally, and the other is that many on the left and the right sure do hate Jews and not feel they need to hide that fact. Together, these are a massive topic beyond what any one podcast episode could do justice to. What connects them, what doesn't connect them, I do not claim that I am going to have an answer for you right now or ever. However, to just sort of slowly broach such topics, today the topic is going to be a strange sort of left-right horseshoe type convergence happening in the United States. And here to help sort that out is David Schraub. David is an associate professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. He's also a commentator for places like The Atlantic, The Forward, and Haaretz, but I know him originally for probably something like 20 years now from his blog, The Debate Link, where he did a recent post about the American politician or would-be politician Graham Platner, and that's really the main thing, although we have other things to talk about, that David is back on the Jewish Angle to talk about. So, David, welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me on again.
So first off, Maine is cold like Canada. It's near Canada, but it's not part of Canada. So for any Canadian listeners or any listeners anywhere who might not know, who is Graham Platner?
So Graham Platner is running for a U.S. Senate seat in the state of Maine. Right now we're still in the party primaries, so he's running as a Democrat, but he still has to, receive the Democratic nomination. His primary opponent is the current governor of Maine, Janet Mills, and then they're both, whoever is nominated will challenge the incumbent Republican Senator Susan Collins, who has been a thorn in Democrat side for a while. She has this very self-styled reputation as a moderate, but has been a pretty consistent vote in favor of Donald Trump and Trump's policies, for her entire career in the Senate. So it's a seat that Democrats very much want to win. Maine is a state that typically votes Democrat, so it feels achievable. And so this primary is getting a lot of attention, and has become sort of yet another instance of this divide between what we might call establishment candidates. Mills, again, she's the governor. She's, she's 79 years old, so she's not a young woman. But she's perfectly progressive, but she's sort of tied into the party apparatus. And then someone like Platner, who's running more as an outsider, someone who's going to shake things up. He presents himself as this sort of working man, oyster farmer. And
I wanted to talk about that a little bit, actually, but I don't want to cut you off if you had more on.
No, I think that gets us to the basic background. This sort of establishment insurgent divide that's been part of Democratic politics for quite some time now.
Sure. So the oyster farmer aspect of things is significant, not because oysters aren't kosher, delicious but not kosher, but rather because basically it seems like he, from what I have read, is maybe slightly misrepresenting his class origins. Is there a part of that going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much an aesthetic. He's burly, he's got a beard, he's got tattoos, right? And all of that kind of hides the fact that, yeah, he's not someone that, came up from hard scrabble, nothing. He went to my understanding, some very Tony private schools,
Hotchkiss. I
right?
mean,
That's
yeah.
pretty tip of the top.
He's from
Um,
some posh family that, but I guess I mean, it's interesting. Like, it is so much a construct, right? Like, you can present how you choose to present yourself, especially in US politics.
Yeah, it's very much an aesthetic. And Democrats have seen this, before, been very attracted to somebody who at least presents the image of, this sort of working class American that Democrats feel like they haven't really been able to grab onto since FDR maybe or JFK. And so they're looking for people. Fetterman is another example of somebody who had that aesthetic, but now, is very much kind of not popular amongst the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
I
And so
thought
there's
that Fetterman was Jewish for the longest time and was like stunned when I was writing about philo-Semitism to realize that that is in fact
no,
not the case.
yeah.
So
I,
so here's the reason we're speaking about Graham Platner is not because the elections of Maine are of such fascinating interest to Canadian Jews, but rather because of a few different things. So, like, one anti Semitism scandal, you could say, huh, maybe that was nothing. Once you get to the number we're talking here, so what are they? Let's lay them out here.
so the original one that kind of kicked everything off, it was the discovery that he has a Nazi tattoo on his chest, or he had one, I believe. Now finally he's covered it up, but he only covered it up in the wake of the story breaking in the middle of the campaign. And he originally said, oh, I didn't know, I was drunk, I thought it was just a cool skull, and it was not until later. There's a lot of evidence that he in fact knew. And that story is kind of that apology is kind of BS. Following that, he was, happily retweeting kind of neo-Nazi commentators on the
That's
subject
been
of the
recently, right? The
that's yeah, within the
retweeting.
past week or two, I want to say.
Right, because I think
Um,
that's really important to say, because I think there's a difference when we talk about politicians or anybody's social media. Are you talking about like journalists digging up something from 2002 or 2012, or are you talking about what they're doing now? And I feel like what they're doing now is particularly
Right.
perhaps
Yeah,
relevant.
this
Yes.
has been on the campaign trail, this sort of elevation. And then on a podcast of another kind of white supremacist, anti-Semitic podcaster, whom he said something like at the opening, like, "Oh, I'm a long time big fan of the show." So it's not just, something, at least in his telling, that he was just making the rounds. This is somebody who he's saying was a long-standing influence on him. And again, somebody who's really gone all in on a host of kind of racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so I think that that's interesting because it is suggesting that this isn't simply like I and this I mean this is hard to get into because I think there is something where like things can get in a kind of purity politics space where who appeared on which podcast, all of this gets kind of picked apart. And some people I have seen online are trying to kind of spin it like that. Like, well, how are the Democrats ever going to win if if candidates can only appear on the podcast of somebody lovely? How are Democrats going to reach the common man? How are Democrats going to reach swing voters? How are Democrats going to reach demographics that are otherwise out of reach these days? It seems like this is a bit above and beyond trying to reach different audiences.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there definitely is, I think, you know, implicit in that complaint about, that you have to step beyond your own little bubble, is a sort of very patronizing outlook about what the common man really wants. And this idea, and it's always coming from people who, grew up in, in where I grew up in Bethesda, or grew up in Park Slope or whatever, telling everybody else that, oh, in order to appeal to the common man, of course, there's nothing you can do other than, show off your Nazi tattoo and get on, and it's like, I don't know. I'm not fully convinced that impact is as popular or as necessary as one thinks it is. So,
Although what you wrote about, though, suggests that you think this is kind of what he's running on. So just to quote from your blog post, you wrote, one thing I think they still haven't wrapped their heads around is the real possibility, that's like the Democratic establishment, that Platner's anti-Semitic associations are a selling point for him. They're not something he's had to overcome. They're part of why, in the context of this particular "I'm a fighter, I'm tackling the powerful, I'm beholden to nobody" aesthetic, Platner is as popular as he is. End quote. I think that's brilliant, and I think it's also super depressing. Has it become this? Because, like, I would agree with you that everyday Americans had not been all that into Nazis or whatever you want to call it. But, like, it does seem that something has changed, and changed, I even want to say very recently. I don't even think this is an Israel Gaza thing. I think this is like with this Epstein stuff. It seems like there really is this explosion of conspiracy thinking and all of this.
Yeah. No, I think that is what is very worrisome and is sort of the angle that I don't think has gotten enough attention. I think a lot of people are either saying, oh, he's doing this outrageous thing, it's anti-Semitic, and therefore that should sink his campaign. And then other people who they're either denying there's anti-Semitism at all, like they're coming up with various excuses, or they're saying something like this is again something he's overcome, like it's the idea that, oh, if you hadn't ran a geriatric kind of old matron like Janet Mills, then we wouldn't be forced to, reluctantly support somebody, like Graham Platner, who has this baggage but is good in other ways. And what I'm worried about and what I'm seeing is that neither of those are correct. That there's rather this kind of broader anti-establishment tide that when you just hold yourself out as someone who just doesn't care, right? Who doesn't, who isn't going to bow down to what other people think or say or, tell you can't do. A lot of people find that very freeing because they feel like they've been very suppressed. And that goes all the way back, I think, to the first time that Donald Trump ran, to be perfectly honest, right?
Yeah.
And it's not even, for some people, it's they wanted to tell those same racist jokes. They wanted to tell those same, misogynistic quips. For some, it's very, very straightforward. But there's also some people who maybe didn't want to say exactly those things, but still enjoyed the fantasy of freedom, that they felt like they were walking on eggshells all the time and there was just stuff they weren't allowed to say. And here's somebody who's saying all of that stuff and nothing bad is happening to him. He seems untouchable. And that felt really freeing to them. And of course, when it comes to Jews, and this is, partially about Israel, but not entirely, there's also, I think, this very widespread public narrative about, like, I got to walk on eggshells. There's these things I can't say. If I step out of line, the big bad, lobby is going to come after me and destroy my career. And so somebody who feels impervious to that, and is, we could say, peacocking in a certain way. The Nazi tattoo is going above and beyond, right? Is a very powerful symbol of that perceived silencing effects being broken. And I think people get a very ecstatic, almost orgasmic pleasure out of finding that freedom.
It's interesting that it's happening on the Democratic side. I mean, so what you say about Trump, I'm glad you bring up Trump because my thoughts about this actually came out of that when I was writing my 2017 book about the sort of call outs of the day. During the time of writing it, Trump became the nominee. So that would have been 2016, right? Whatever, 2015, 2016, when I was writing the book. And I had to make sense of this, sort of in real time, how did this all fit together? And I definitely at the time, and this is in the book, I wrote that basically this was, people were living vicariously through this person who, despite being a politician, was so politically incorrect, right? Like that was really what he was up to. But, so I do see this sort of feature, not a bug thing and how that started with Trump. I think there's something very weird and concerning about it happening on the Democratic side. But I'm also wondering sort of like strategically what can be done about this, because like I'm thinking about, so this morning I saw a Jewish Insider email, like a newsletter email, and the headline, like the subject heading was something about New York Mayor Mamdani's wife having liked Instagram posts celebrating October 7th. And I see a headline like this, and I think on the one hand, that's not very nice. On the other, I don't know what kind of political strategy, like where we're getting with like politician's wife liked post in 2023. I feel like, does anybody care? Maybe they should
Mhm.
care, but does, you know what I mean? And then there's just, so I'm wondering like whether that type of digging things up needs to be less so that people can kind of focus on like appearing on neo-Nazi podcast and saying that you're a big fan is maybe different from having liked a, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going
Yeah,
with
I
this.
mean, part of the problem is we say like, "Oh, this who can we police?" There's not
Yeah.
some, central committee
Yeah.
of political research. And with Mamdani's wife, for example, I kind of assume that felt very tit for tat against recent, there was reports about some tweets and likes and social media posts or whatever by Dan Goldman's wife in the wake of October 7th that were, being circulated as being kind of anti-Palestinian, for example, and were being used as an attack. And it was very, those
They've
the
let the
peak.
women have internet and look what has happened.
It's I mean,
We're liking posts left and right.
it's chaos out there. It's Katie bar the door. But yeah. So and the it's both the way Goldman and Mamdani kind of responded was basically identical. That like my opinions are my opinions, and you can see what I've written, and so you shouldn't impute anything to me. But yeah, we can say that some of this is a unfortunate trend. But I have no idea what it would look like to stop it. Um, Part of maybe what's happening, and this goes to, this flowing out of the Epstein situation and all of that, is, just a collapse in trust in extant social institutions. And that, we can be talking about like the US government, but we can be talking about like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And just a belief that, what the sources that we used to take our cues from as, oh, this is probably somebody worth listening to, this is probably a respectable figure. Now we don't really believe that. But what's replacing it is very anarchic, right?
Well, it's anarchic, but I think it is also very specifically anti-Semitic because I think Jews are very associated with kind of it's not even exactly like the people who had been in charge, but it's more just kind of like sort of powers that be in the sense of like educational institutions, sort of respected institutions were like very much Jews were welcome, at least, not always in charge of them or anything. But yeah, and I feel like there is something where there's what I see in a lot of there's a certain style of writing I've seen about Epstein where the issue presented is not awful sex crimes or even like sneaky financial wheelings and dealings, but rather look at all of these sort of posh people from the 90s hanging out together. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that whether this is true actually descriptively is an empirical matter. In the public imagination, like the kind of class markers of Jewish that we associate, in varying ways tend to be thought of as wealthier, thought of as more educated, thought of as like connected, often thought of as powerful, right? And so if all of those markers are, now coming under suspicion, it's really easy to, view like choose a sort of this like super concentrated version of everything you don't like about the current political system. Um, and then maybe particularly for people who don't want to just burn everything down and start fresh, right? It's like, well, how do we make things tractable? How do we fix this sort of inchoate sense that everything is all messed up? And we can't get rid of everybody. We can't, abolish every university. We can't, completely, destroy every single, member of the, every single incumbent. Um, but Jews are smaller, right?
Well, that
That is,
seems so huge to this. And this is something I've written about recently, this sort of the function of anti-Semitism. Like, what is it doing? And I
mhm.
think a lot of it is, and this is actually kind of getting into my next question for you, but like this common ground function. Because it seems like what's more significant possibly than Platner himself is the reaction to him that he's doing so well, that he's polling so well, that these things are not deal breakers that one might think would be. So I would just want to talk a little bit about his broader significance for American politics and what this says about this kind of left-right alignment, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion that I think is accurate that kind of transcending left-right divides in the United States, and I think in other countries too. There's a related but separate sort of, again, high trust, low trust divide, right? Establishment on anti-establishment divide, that isn't cleanly um maps onto a particular party. And one of you talk about, how do you appeal to swing voters? And one of the insights that political scientists have always known, but political commentators don't always internalize, is that your swing voter typically is not somebody who just sits smack in the middle of the political spectrum. It's somebody who tends to be relatively low information, doesn't have a lot of trust in political institutions, and what political beliefs they do have just are kind of very scattershot, as somebody who thinks we should have the death penalty for abortion and universal health care, right? And so that sort of person really is open to being appealed to by members of either party, right? But in a very particular way where, it's picking up on particular anxieties or pessimisms that they have about the ongoing political system, which they often just feel very negatively towards, but don't have a ton of engagement with or information about. Um, and for someone like Platner in particular, I think that there is this gap between a group of relatively high information, kind of consultants, commentators who, who very much are tied into, party politics. They might view themselves as outsiders, but they know what's up. They're not people who don't pay attention to politics. They very much do. And then a much larger kind of groundswell base of people who aren't particularly politically engaged, but just see someone who feels like a fighter. And when they're feeling like they're not being fought for, this person again is not someone who's some shrinking violet. And the former group, I don't think takes fully seriously what the latter group stands for. And that
Mm-hmm.
once again goes back to Trump, where I think you had a kind of Republican consultancy class that really thought, oh, we can just ride the rubes for a while, but like when the time comes, we're going to still be the ones in charge. We can rein it all in if we need to. Turns out, no, they can't, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
not able to just pump the brakes. And a similar sort of thing, I think, with some of the forces that Platner represents, is that, you're not going to be able to pump the brakes and say like, oh, actually, we want to make sure that this sort of conspiratorial anti-Semitism doesn't break containment, because they're not actually listening to you. It's not actually your savvy reasons for supporting Platner. It's a much more kind of manifestation of the lizard brain.
I mean, what I want to kind of anchor this a little bit in time, which is to say that we're recording this on March 6th. The US and Israel have recently attacked Iran. There is a lot of sort of finger pointing with sort of Republicans saying Israel made us do it, with Democrats perhaps being too amenable to just nodding along to that. We're like Platner, it's also that there's this moment where there's a lot of kind of isolationist sentiment, also a lot of like it's more of a natural place, the Democratic Party, for some of the types of positions he's representing. At the same time, most American Jews do vote Democrat and presumably are not super enthusiastic about every sort of whim Trump has. So yeah, I don't know. Like, do you think that some of this has to do with there being a particular appeal right now of somebody who says who sort of, well, is it perceived of as sort of a political break from Israel to,
Mhm.
go around with a barely covered up or badly covered up, I should say, Nazi tattoo.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely the case, right? And there's just, little question that amongst the Democratic base right now, there is a immense, frustration is the mildest way that I can put it, with, with Israel and with Netanyahu and with their behavior. I think there's a very, there's a cadre certainly that looks is just, is horrified at what Israel's done over the past several years, views it as completely been overtaken by essentially its own version of, MAGA fascism, essentially. It has been meting it out on innocent Palestinians for years now. But even amongst, the more establishment minded group, we might say that those persons, I think their outlook is that Joe Biden risked a ton of political capital to stand with Israel and to stand with Bibi, and to support Israel, and in return they got smacked in the face, right? And it's, Israel has proven itself to be an unreliable partner. It has proven itself that, that it does not view the relationship it has historically had with the entirety of the American, community as a reciprocal one. And so listen, we went to bat for you once, and it blew up in our face. Fool me once, fool me twice, right? We're not going to go through that again. So I think there is again this large sense of a need to and a desire to see some daylight, as the old saying used to go, um between Israel and American policy. And again, but you tie that into this sort of burbling sensation of, oh, and the they is
Hmm.
vague, but not that vague, right? They won't let you do it. They don't want to allow that. They're going to step in to destroy your career if you do. And again, then you're looking for somebody who seems impervious to that sort of backlash, who seems to just not care to, be willing to be what's that meme about that one man standing up in the town hall and saying no,
Hmm.
right? That be that sort of figure. Right. And again,
Yeah.
I think that's a lot more aesthetic than it is substantive in a lot of cases, because I think there are a lot of Democrats in a lot of different ways now, that are, I think, quite appropriately, to be perfectly honest, um, signaling that that we need to take a more principled line, when it comes to, an Israeli government that's aligning with far right forces. But if it's not just about the policy, but also about the signaling of, like, I'm not gonna be like, you don't have to worry about me being co-opted by them, right? Well,
Hmm.
there's one thing I don't have to worry about Platner, is that, he's gonna be too solicitous of Jewish views, right?
Well,
That
it's
you have to
there
worry
is
about that.
something that I find kind of frustrating to the point of I don't even know what to make of it, where this whole sort of rhetoric that's developing around the Jews got us into this war, American Jews voted for Harris. American Jews vote Democrat. American Jews are aware that Republicans have long been the more hawkish and pro-Israel of the two parties. Yes, fine, the Democrats used to be more sort of reliably pro-Israel than they have been lately, but like the idea that if you're looking for which group of people to pin this on, you're looking at a voting base that did not put Trump in office. And Trump
Mhm.
knows that.
Yeah.
So I feel like the most you could say is, yeah, Trump says he's doing a lot of things, to fight anti Semitism, the things that American Jews don't want him doing. Like, I don't know. I find this frustrating.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
well, I mean, it's clearly exculpatory, right?
right.
If the Jews got us into us, then we're not the problem. We were manipulated. We had our strings pulled in a direction that doesn't reflect the true soul of the people, right? It provides a method of exculpation. And it's also similar to, again, this ongoing debate within, the American progressive community, where obviously a lot of people say anybody who wasn't all in for Biden and then Harris in 2024 They're saying like, oh, it's your fault that we got into this. We did our job. We voted for Harris. You were out there dragging your feet or moaning and groaning or threatening to go third party, right? You're the ones who got us into this, right? And so this idea of like, kind of pointing fingers, who's really to blame, and nobody wants to be taking responsibility for this. Everybody's looking for an escape route. I think even the Republicans to some extent, when they kind of run this line of, we had to do this because Israel, are giving themselves an escape hatch in case things go squirrely, right? So I do think that that part of this is about providing an escape from responsibility, because as you say, the Jewish community doesn't do the things that it is often asserted to do, right? And again, this has been for years. I remember when Obama was first elected, and there was a newspaper headline in Europe that said this represents the end of Jewish control in America. And like, I don't know if there ever was an era of Jewish control in America, but I'm not sure the election of a president who got 75% of the Jewish vote is like, is what I would choose to like prove, the Jews are on the ropes, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah. Oh boy. There's so much I want to ask you about, but I'm gonna not ask the super long question that could go on many tangents, and I will instead stick with one final question, which is that just basically it's not even such a question as a quote that I've been thinking about a lot. Like it's from a post by Don Moynihan, who's an academic and has a big Blue Sky account, and he posted shortly after the attack on Iran. He posted, I'm quoting now, "The Iran war is going to fuel a new level of anti-Semitism," end quote. I've been sitting with this quote. I've written something a bit about it that isn't up yet, but I've been just thinking about this because, like, there's just this weird way that that world events and local events and so forth get looked at, where it's like, well, if such and such happened, there's just something. I don't know if it's that it's victim blaming or more just that I don't actually think that you can point to different things like this as causes of anti-Semitism. It seems more that they are pretexts to me for anti-Semitism, because it just, I'm just not convinced. Like, I think there are all sorts of reasons to say, criticize whatever it is you're criticizing, like to criticize how Israel's approached Gaza. I think that's a fine thing to criticize. I would never criticize it from the lens of, and that's why we now have anti-Semitism, because not because I think that that's like mean to do or wrong to do morally, but I just genuinely don't think it is. Like, I don't know. Like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, do we have the whole what's causing anti-Semitism thing a little bit possibly off?
yeah, I mean, the worry about victim blaming, I think, is legitimate. We don't ever want to say, oh, if Jews just dressed differently, then this wouldn't,
Right.
then none of this would happen. And at the same time, right, the question of like what makes anti-Semitism go up or down is an empirical question, right? And so I might prefer maybe this is just playing with words a little bit, but to talk about something being an activator of anti-Semitism, right? Because I don't think there's any universe, and I think it is a form of exculpation that's undeserved for somebody to say like, oh, I couldn't help but become anti-Semitic given what's going on in Iran. I think that gives people way too much credit. They're responsible for their own choices. But it certainly is the case that certain, global events and decisions, right?
But also how they're covered, right? I mean, I think that you could say, like, however badly you might think Israel is doing its decision making, there are certain stories get more airtime than other stories, certain perspectives, and then once you move away from like mainstream news outlets and you're talking about what's on TikTok or whatever, like, yeah, I don't know. If that's why for me it doesn't, I don't believe, like, I genuinely just don't think that you can do a graph where Jews and Israel are doing something more bad, there's more anti-Semitism, less bad, less anti-Semitism. Like, I don't
No,
know that it maps.
I don't
Yeah.
think it's that straightforward, but I do
Yeah.
think it is the case that when like there are highly Jewish salient issues in the public eye that people are mad about, right? the sort of underlying reservoir of anti-Semitic sentiment starts to boil, right? And so it's not that it created the reservoir when it wasn't present before; it just activates it, right? It takes something that maybe was just latent and lurking in the background, but wasn't particularly, front of mind, and makes it a lot more front of mind. One, I think, this is, I think, a common mistake that people make about not just anti-Semitism, about a lot of forms of isms, is they assume that the anti-Semitism exists only or primarily in people for whom that's like their primary social identity. And just all the time, they're either thinking about how much they hate the Jews, or like, I wish I could hate the Jews more, but right now I'm not allowed to, so I'm staying silent. For a lot of people, it's just like, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's one belief amongst many. And in many, many circumstances, it's not something that is particularly important or salient or motivating. And really just kind of, they have these views that are not great, but sort of sit in the background, kind of dormant. And then something like maybe the Iran war, and the way, as you say, the way that it's being covered, comes, and now suddenly something that was very much back of mind turns to front of mind. So it's not creating something that wasn't present, but it is altering kind of the prioritization that people have in terms of what things matter to them the most, and what they're willing to, which issue areas become non-negotiables.
Oh, that's a good way of looking at it. David Schraub, thank you so much for coming back on The Jewish Angle. Interesting and fun as always.
Always good to be here, and I enjoy our conversations. Hope to be back soon.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.